Revenge films.
This is my younger brother's epic story. My grandfather had 2 children, my father and my uncle. My Uncle Jerry didn't have any sons, just 2 daughters. And in my family, I have 1 younger brother. My grandfather was the 4th generation family line of business owners in the countryside. His company went public after the Second World War. He was the chairman, and my uncle was the CEO. It was a mid-sized family-run business with sloppy accounting. My grandfather and uncle had a strong belief that the eldest son should inherit everything, and were male chauvinists who only believed in family. Uncle Jerry didn't have a son, so they had decided amongst themselves to make my younger brother Gary marry my uncle's eldest daughter Melinda and make Gary inherit the company. My father had been trained to follow orders ever since he was a child, so he didn't argue about it at all. Uncle Jerry was unbearably mean to his wife and would always insult her. He treated her as if she was a useless slave because she wasn't able to bear a son for them. Auntie Jane was human too, after all, so she would secretly cry and complain about Jerry. But she knew better than to fight him because she knew that nothing would change either way. My mother got it a little better than Jane because she was able to have my brother, but it seems that she was often told to sleep with Jerry and to have a boy for him. What a bunch of psychopaths, right? Gary was treated like a king because he was the only boy in the family. The grandchildren were all ranked as well, and I was at the bottom of the pyramid. On special occasions, Gary and Melinda were the only ones who got to eat the good stuff. And when we would order sushi, Gary would get the expensive ones and I would get the cheap leftovers. This kind of discrimination was so normal ever since we were small children, so I numbed myself to it early on and grew up feeling that it was normal. Gary was easily influenced like my father, so he never really questioned his position either and just acted like it was normal. It was such a toxic environment for me, so I left as soon as I graduated high school and moved into the city. I kept my distance from my brother and other relatives, including my parents. Living alone was great. All of my complex relationships and constraints dissolved, and I was happy to finally be living a peaceful life. A few years later, my grandfather turned 80, the same year that Gary turned 20, and decided to retire. So he invited the employees at his company along with all of our relatives to celebrate. According to my mother, my grandfather and uncle had decided on their own to announce Gary and Melinda's engagement and Gary's new position as CEO at the party. Of course, Melinda wasn't asked what she wanted, and I could never tell what Gary was thinking anyways. I was not planning on going, but Melinda called me up and asked me to come. I wanted to ask her how she felt about marrying my brother, but part of me was scared to know her true feelings and be devastated for her. My grandfather also insisted that every family member had to be there, and I was able to get that day off work, so I went. Honestly, part of me was going for the thrill as well. They rented the biggest hotel venue in town that day. My grandfather and uncle were using my aunt and mother like servants that day as well. Gary was running a little late, so Melinda and I ran around serving drinks to people. I've been away from all this family business for a while now, so even though it was a one-time thing, it was pretty annoying to be used like that. So Melinda and I just continued to entertain the guests while my mother and Aunt Jane hustled behind the scenes. After a while, Melinda changed into a nice dress and sat next to her father.
Yeah, let the woman serve you your drinks, everyone. They can get on their knees while they're at it, am I right?
I felt like I could stab Uncle Jerry for his disgusting jokes. I was getting sick that this was Melinda's father, and soon to be my little brother's father-in-law. He must have been feeling like his life was set now that his daughter was marrying Gary. He was in a great mood, and his drinks flowed. About an hour in, as people were loosening up, Gary finally arrived. My grandfather and uncle stood up and were preparing to announce the engagement as they waited for Gary to enter the room. Then suddenly, Gary appeared in a white dress and beautiful makeup. Commotion spread throughout the room and chaos followed. Beer was spewing out of some of the guests' mouths as well. My mother and aunt dropped the glasses that they had in their hands and stood there in awe. My father was panicking and looked like he was about to foam from the mouth. After a moment of silence, Gary finally spoke.
I'll be Melinda's new wife soon. I won't be able to have a child, but I'll obey everything you say, Uncle Jerry. Please take me as your daughter.
There was another moment of silence. Then,
Are you kidding us? What the hell?
my grandfather and uncle's cries filled the room. My father was still panicking, and the guests were confused. It was just pure chaos in that room. I had been away from home for a while and hadn't stayed in close touch with Gary, so it was quite shocking to find out that he was on that side of the spectrum. My mother and Aunt Jane were shocked because Gary had never expressed that side of himself before. They just looked at each other, shook their heads, and stared back at Gary in disbelief. Some guests went over to hold back my grandfather and Uncle Jerry, who were still yelling at Gary. And then the whole party was called off. Everyone left without any time to even say goodbye. No way they could announce their children's engagement. It was a complete disaster. It was a small countryside town, and none of the guests had ever seen a transgender before, so the rumors spread like wildfire. The rumors sparked new rumors, and people started rumoring that Uncle Jerry might have been sexually abusing Gary and things like that. They quickly became the talk of the town, and their business tumbled downhill. A year later, they had to shut down their business. Apparently, Gary hadn't thought much of everything that was going on around him while he was growing up, but once he got into college and started making friends, he realized how unusual it was for him to be treated like that by his relatives. After giving it some thought, Gary wanted to ruin their plans and had planned everything with Melinda starting 6 months ago. They had to think of a good and legal way to do the most damage and thought of this plan. They were the only two who knew about the plan. They asked one of Melinda's beautician friends to help and went out to rent a real wedding dress for the occasion and shaved all of Gary's body hair as well. They thoroughly planned for that day. It was Gary who thought of the plan, but I was surprised to find out Melinda was in on it too. That day, she sat next to her father and poured drinks to the guests without even a hint that she had been in on it. Gary's acting was pretty on point too. But Melinda's poker face was quite amazing as well. My grandfather did not feel well after that, and is kind of out of it recently. My uncle had shut himself in, so the ladies were free from their opposition. I felt a little bad that the family business fell apart because of that incident, but my mother and aunt weren't disappointed about it at all. They were furious at first when they found out Gary and Melinda planned such a thing, but in the end, they had some weight lifted off their shoulders after they saw that the men got what they deserved. They were treated like slaves at home until then, but after the incident, they were able to get part-time jobs, and after decades of being secluded from society, they were excited about their freedom and were now filled with life compared to the men who lost all of theirs. Now that they have found their place in the world, they've become much happier and positive people. I'm glad that they don't complain half as much as they used to. I felt the same sort of relief when I started living alone, so I could really sympathize with how they must feel now. On top of everything, things were complicated for a while, but Melinda and Gary got much closer after the incident, and they really ended up getting married. Part of me thought that if they were going to get married anyways, that they didn't have to ruin the marriage announcement in the first place. But it was because of that whole prank that they got closer, so I guess things are a little more complicated than that. They had a baby boy after that. If my grandfather and uncle were still sane, they probably would have been very excited about it. Gary and Melinda didn't plan to raise their son in the same toxic environment that they were raised in. After everything they did, I was relieved to hear how normal their minds were. I hated my hometown after everything that I went through as a child, but now I have a cute nephew back home and a new sister-in-law. My mother and aunt are happier now too, so I'm excited to go back once in a while.
How was today's video? If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Stay tuned for more.